Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Riancho, and these are my running back rankings for week 6 intended for half PPR leagues. But there are some players that are not ranked due to injury. Christian McCaffrey and Isaiah Pacheco are on IR. I'm not expecting Jonathan Taylor to play this week. I also am not sure about Joe Mixon returning or Jahmyr White and Devin Singletary. All of them missed last week's game, if not even more than that, and I really do not expect any of them to play as of Tuesday. We'll see. I'll update these ranks on Saturday, but at the moment, none of these players are ranked. I also did not rank Jaylen Warren or Cordarrelle Patterson. I also didn't rank Dameon Pierce, although he did practice last week. He did not play. And Nick Chubb and Jonathan Brooks are still on IR at the moment. I'm not quite sure when they'll return. For now, I did not rank them. There's also some players on bye for teams altogether. Kyren Williams and Blake Corum of the Rams on bye. Aaron Jones and Ty Chandler also on bye. Kareem Hunt, CEH, Samaje Perine, and Carson Steele of the Chiefs on bye as well. And then Devon Achane, Raheem Mostert, and Jalen Wright also on bye. None of them are ranked in this video. So a lot of players just taken out of the equation. Let's get into it. Let's begin at the top, where I think in terms of confidence, you have to love Saquon Barkley's performance this year. I think he's clearly the obvious RB1 at the moment. While you can make a case for some other players, he's been lights out. An average of 22 points per game this season on 21.3 touches per game, 3 catches per game, 130 yards per game, and 5 touchdowns in 4 games, an average of 6 yards per carry. He is on fire, and the Browns have given up 6 rushing touchdowns this season. They just gave up 3 to the Commanders. So Saquon's going to be just fine. Definitely lighting up Saquon every week. Number 2, I have Derrick Henry versus Washington, who is still playing excellent. He did need overtime to really give you like an excellent game last week, but still he's a lock in your lineup. In 5 games this season, he's averaging 21.4 points per game on over 20 touches. While he's not catching many passes, who cares? 124 yards per game and 7 touchdowns this season. He's lighting it up every single week. So Derrick Henry, a player you must start. And same goes for Alvin Kamara, who comes in here at number 3 versus Tampa Bay. And I know last week was a dud against the Chiefs, but the Chiefs are actually the toughest matchup for running backs in fantasy across the NFL. So that's the reason why I'm not panicking on Kamara. I'm still trusting him. He's been excellent this year. 21.5 points per game, just like Henry, with 6 touchdowns, 120 yards per game. He's lighting it up. He's still a workhorse. I'm a little bit worried about Derek Carr's injury, though. If Derek Carr does not play, I'll probably bump down all of the Saints in my ranks. Their offense would not be as good if Carr is not available. So for now, he's still RB3, but we'll see. This ranking might change at the end of the week. Number 4, though, I am still trusting Bijan Robinson. I know he's been very disappointing this season. In 5 games, only averaging 11.7 points per game, 17 touches, 3.6 catches, 87 yards. It's a decent floor, but only 1 touchdown. Very concerning. The upside has just not been there for Bijan. However, this is the week where I think he gets back on track. If he doesn't, I will very much panic. But he should play very well against the Panthers because it's the number 1 matchup for opposing running backs. They allow 29.6 points per game to the position, 121 rushing yards per game, 35 receiving yards per game, 10 touchdowns overall in 5 games to running backs. So even if Algier vultures one, Bijan should still find the end zone. If he doesn't, then I'd panic. But in this game, I think he's going to be top 5. I was tempted to rank him at number 1, but given his track record so far, I just can't do it. This is the highest I can go. It's because of the matchup why I'm ranking him top 5. But if not, I would probably rank him around RB 10, 11, maybe even lower. You're not happy with Bijan this season. You're also not happy with Breece Hall, but mainly just the last 2 games. He was pretty good the first 3, but he's kind of fallen off. The last 2 games, he has not scored a touchdown. But this season, he's still averaging 12.2 points per game. It's decent. 17.2 touches per game, 4.2 catches per game. 69 yards per game, though, is pretty mediocre. It's nothing special. He has scored 3 touchdowns, and that's why I still believe in him in fantasy. I think he'll be fine because just like Bijan, he gets an elite matchup. The Bills rank number 2 so far this season against opposing running backs. They allow 27.9 points per game, 109 rushing yards per game, but especially in the passing game, that is where running backs go off. 7.2 catches per game for 62 receiving yards per game, along with 6 total touchdowns to the position. Breece will bounce back, especially in the passing game. I think that's really where he will shine this week. And especially after they fired Robert Saleh and he's played badly the last 2 weeks, you know they're going to adjust their game plan and definitely give him a ton of work. He will bounce back for sure. I still believe in Breece Hall. I trust him a little bit more than Bijan rest of season, but I think the matchup is just better for Bijan this week. That's the reason why I have Bijan one spot higher. But I think both of these players will bounce back, will have a good week in week 5. The matchup is great. Number 6, though, I have Kenneth Walker versus San Francisco, who's been lights out in 3 games this season. 20.2 points per game is his average. I know last week was kind of bad. He did not find the end zone, but I really don't worry about it. He's averaging 100 yards per game. He has 4 touchdowns on the season, and he scored 3 of them against Detroit, an elite run defense dating back to last year. So he's too talented to bench. He's still a player I'm starting, still top 10, and this week against the Niners, not the best matchup possible, but on Thursday night, I'm not too worried about it. I think he'll be fine. I think the Seahawks do bounce back and play a lot better on offense. So he's my RB6. You cannot bench Kenneth Walker. You also cannot bench either of the Detroit Lions running backs. I have Jahmyr Gibbs and Dave Montgomery back-to-back here at number 7 and 8, and they get a very good matchup. The Cowboys rank top 5 against the running back position, giving up 24.2 points per game, 97 rushing yards per game, 44 receiving yards per game, and 6 total touchdowns in 5 weeks to the position. So Gibbs and Montgomery are going to tear it up. They're averaging very identical numbers in terms of fantasy points this year. Gibbs with 16.4 points per game, Montgomery with 16.3. They both have 4 touchdowns. They both have 90 yards per game. Montgomery has 91. Gibbs gets slightly more work in the passing game, but they're both involved. It's basically a 1A, 1B situation. And while I do prefer Gibbs just barely, I still think Montgomery's top 10. He's a lock in your lineup. Both of them have been excellent this season. You can't bench the Lions running backs. Number 9, I have Josh Jacobs versus Arizona. And finally, he scored a touchdown last week, and it did probably help that there were a lot of players banged up and injured. But this is a good matchup for him. Once again, it ranks top 7 against the position. Arizona has allowed 23.9 points per game to running backs this year, 122 rushing yards per game, 27 receiving yards per game, and 6 touchdowns to the position. So I think Jacobs gets back in the end zone, and that's really the only thing that's been missing for him this year. The volume is there, 19.6 touches per game. While he's not catching many passes, only 1.6 per game, he's giving you 95 yards per game, and if the touchdown hits, you're going over 16 fantasy points. Jacobs has a very safe floor, and I think the ceiling is there this week. His 11.1 points per game this season will increase after this week. So love Jacobs. I'm still trusting him. He's kind of bust proof. It's just a matter of will the touchdown hit or not. This week, I think it will. Number 10, though, I have James Cook at the Jets. And for some reason, he was playing very well last week, and then they went away from him in the second half. They should have given him the ball at the end of the game. But I still think he's a big part of this offense. He's one of the safest running backs overall. And if it wasn't for this matchup, I'd probably rank him top 7. However, the Jets rank bottom 7 against the position. The number 25 matchup only allowing 17.1 points per game. They did just fire Robert Saleh, so maybe the defense gets worse, but I still think the talent is good enough to limit him on the ground. They only allow 96 rushing yards per game to the position, 29 receiving yards per game, but especially in the touchdown department, only 2 touchdowns so far in 5 games. So a little bit worried that James Cook doesn't find the end zone here, but I think he'll be fine. I'm still starting him. He's been lights out this season, averaging 15.7 points per game with 5 total touchdowns. I'm not worried about it. I think James Cook will still perform well, and he's still a lock in your lineup. RB10 for me in week 5. Number 11, I have Chuba Hubbard versus Atlanta. And at some point, Jonathan Brooks will return. But until then, you have to keep firing up Chuba Hubbard. In his last 3 games with Andy Dalton as the quarterback, he's averaging 21 fantasy points per game in half PPR. He's a workhorse, 21.7 touches per game, 4.3 catches per game is one of the highest averages in the NFL for running backs this year. 128 yards per game is more than Derrick Henry, albeit in 5 games, and Chuba has scored 3 touchdowns over the last 3 games. So maybe you think it's cherry picking, but even if you look at the 5-game sample size, he's averaging 14.4 points per game, and this usage is just too big to ignore. You cannot bench Chuba Hubbard. He is in the same category as guys like Josh Jacobs, Kenneth Walker, and James Cook. So love Chuba this week. Maybe in a division matchup, it gets a little dicey, but I don't worry about this Falcons matchup. They're pretty average, and overall, it's not a downgrade. Chuba Hubbard, a lock in your lineup. Even probably when Jonathan Brooks returns, I think his role is still going to be meriting a top 20 ranking, at least the first week for Brooks back on the field. Number 12, though, I have Jordan Mason at Seattle, and that fumble last week was brutal. If he didn't fumble, he probably would have scored a touchdown and probably would have gone over like 16, 17 points. However, last week was tough, but overall this season, he's been pretty good. He's averaging 15.9 points per game, 22.4 touches per game. The volume is fantastic. Only 1.4 catch per game, not ideal, but 120 yards per game and 3 touchdowns. He's kind of just like Chuba Hubbard, a player you have to start and you're hoping it doesn't burn you, but so far the volume is just too high to ignore. The floor is extremely safe, and if he didn't fumble last week, he would have gone over double digits. I'm still starting Jordan Mason, but the floor is a little bit lower. I'm not convinced he finds the end zone every single week. He's not an automatic top 10 play at the moment, but he's still locked into your lineup. RB12 is a player you cannot bench. Number 13 in the exact same tier, I have James Conner at Green Bay, and I view him just the same as Mason and Chuba Hubbard. He's averaging 13.3 points per game this season, 18.2 touches per game, 1.6 catch per game, 89 yards per game, and 3 touchdowns. The touchdown usually hits, and it's not a bad matchup, so there's no downgrade here at all. James Conner is a safe bet in your lineup. Trey Benson's irrelevant, and this offense does move the ball pretty well. They have a limited amount of weapons in the red zone as well, so the touchdown usually goes to Conner. So love him. He's very safe. I think at this point, we've reached the end of the must-start locks every single week. These top 13 are just guaranteed to play in your lineup. There's a few other players like Kyron Williams, Aaron Jones. However, they're on bye and you can't start them. So the top 13 are the best plays this week. Moving forward, though, starting with DeAndre Swift at RB14, it gets a little bit more risky, but the matchup is excellent for Swift this week. The Jags rank top 6 against the position, allowing 24 points per game, and especially in the passing game, Swift has done a lot of damage. He will do that this week because the Jags give up 6.6 catches per game to the position for 57 receiving yards per game, and Swift will capitalize for sure. They've also allowed 6 running back touchdowns this season, and Swift has been a lot better the last 2 games. I think he finds the end zone this week and gives you a lot of yards after the catch in the passing game. So far this season, in 5 games, he's averaging 11.9 points per game, 17.8 touches per game is legit. It's very much a workload you want to buy into. 3 catches per game, 80 total yards per game, and 2 touchdowns, all of which have come in the last 2 weeks. So Swift playing well. Their run game is getting going. It's been established, and I don't think it's going anywhere. Especially in the screen game, I think Swift is going to have a very good game here for fantasy. So love Swift this week. I think he is still a start, and while he could fall to like RB30 any given week in the ranks, I think in good matchups like this, you want to start him. That's why I rank him at 14. I think he's a lock RB2 in your lineup. Number 15, I have Tony Pollard versus the Colts, and the matchup is also good for Pollard this week. The Colts rank number 10 against running backs. They've given up 22.6 points per game this season, 119 yards per game on the ground, 5 catches per game as well, 46 receiving yards per game to the position, and 3 touchdowns as well. So like the spot here for Pollard, we saw Tank Bigsby dominate them last week, and Pollard has looked good in 4 games this season. He's averaging 13 points per game. That's on pace with a guy like James Conner, even more than Bijan Robinson and Breece Hall. So Pollard has been good. 18.5 touches per game, 3.3 catches per game, 83 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. What more could you ask for from Pollard? He's lived up and exceeded expectations. He's been very safe this season. And in a good matchup like this, I think he'll probably find the end zone again. I like Pollard this week. I think he's a very safe play. The volume is trustworthy. Number 16, though, a player who I'm not totally sure if he's healthy. I got Bijan Robinson Jr. at Baltimore. He did not practice on Wednesday and Thursday last week, but did play in the game, and he did not get much work. Only 7 rush attempts for 18 yards. He bailed you out, though, with 2 touchdowns in week 5 against Cleveland. So that is the only reason why I'm trusting him, the touchdown production. But last week, it was a 3-man split in the backfield. Ekeler had 6 carries. McNichols even had 7 carries, and McNichols also scored a touchdown. It's a little bit random what the volume will look like in this backfield. So that's why I'm downgrading him. I had been ranking him top 13 the last couple weeks, but I'm a little bit worried, not only about his health, but especially this matchup. The Ravens are a tough one. They rank bottom 3, number 30 against the running back position, only giving up 15.4 points per game this year. And on the ground, it is terrible. Only 48 rushing yards per game allowed to the position this season. So very tough odds for Bijan Robinson to perform well. He needs that touchdown. They have given up 36 receiving yards per game, though, and also 4 running back touchdowns in 5 games. So if there's one touchdown to be had in this backfield, I expect to go to B-Rob. He scored 5 touchdowns this season, and he is averaging 14.7 points per game in 5 games this year. That's the only reason I still rank him here this high. The touchdown has been extremely reliable to bet on, and that's what I'm leaning into. The rankings get kind of weird moving forward, so while 16 sounds kind of high, it's actually a bit misleading. I think he's actually a lot more risky than this ranking would suggest. So almost more of a flex play, but because of his track record this season, it feels weird to bench him at RB16. I still think you're starting him. At number 17, though, this is dependent on Devin Singletary's health, but at the moment, I do not rank Singletary, and I have Tyrone Tracy versus the Bengals on Sunday night here at number 17. I think he is a good start this week, assuming he gets the workhorse role again. Last week, as the starter in week 5, he had 13.5 points, 19 touches, only 1 catch, but 130 total yards. He was on fire against the Seahawks. The matchup is also pretty good. The Bengals have allowed 5 rushing touchdowns this season, and if he finds the end zone, he's definitely going over 10, 12 plus points. So love Tyrone Tracy as a fill-in your lineup this week. I think he's top 20 because there is no competition at all. Eric Gray is pretty irrelevant, and this offense does move the ball. I do think Tyrone Tracy will play well. The O-line is decent, and the Bengals defense fucking sucks. So Tyrone Tracy, very legit. If he is the starter, should be an RB2 in week 5. Number 18, though, I have Trey Sermon at Tennessee, and Sermon was pretty good last week as the starter as well. 15.3 points, 16 touches, 6 catches. He caught all 6 of his targets, 63 total yards, and a touchdown. The touchdown kind of bailed you out. It was a very good matchup. So he played well when called upon. It's a question of, will he be the starter next week as well? I don't think Taylor will play in week 6, but I think he'll be back by week 7. So I think you have one more week of viability for Trey Sermon. And if you have him, this matchup is not a downgrade. I think he'll be fine. And from a floor standpoint, I think you're getting a very safe double-digit bet with Trey Sermon as long as Taylor remains out. Number 19 and 20, though, players I think you're starting would be the teammates Chase Brown and Zack Moss of the Bengals on Sunday night at the Giants. It's not a bad matchup. It's pretty average. And Chase Brown, I think, is starting to emerge as the guy you want. So far this season, he's only averaging 10 points per game, but in his last 2, it's jumped up to 17.9 points per game on 16 touches per game, 2.5 catches per game, 73 total yards, and 3 touchdowns. He scored 3 touchdowns over the last 2 games. Moss in 5 games is averaging 11.8 points per game. So on the season, he has been a bit better, but it's a bit weighted towards the early part of the year. In his last 2 games, he has been okay. 11.3 points per game, 15.5 touches per game, 3.5 catches per game, 65 yards per game, and 1 touchdown. It came 2 weeks ago. So if you take out the touchdown from the equation of both players, the last 2 games, they've actually been on par with each other. They're both averaging about 8.5 points in fantasy. So that's a very safe floor. I like this matchup, and I think both of them could score again. I prefer Chase Brown. He's starting to look like the more explosive player and getting more touches as well. However, Zach Moss is questionable, dealing with an ankle injury, but he is believed to be okay. It happened at the end of the 4th quarter, and I'm not expecting him to miss any time, but it might limit his snap share. I do think Chase Brown is the better bet at the moment. We'll see what happens in week 6, but I think given the matchup, you want to be starting both options in your lineup. Number 21, though, I have J.K. Dobbins at Denver, and this matchup is bottom 10. They rank number 24, only giving up 17.6 points per game, but that's not like atrociously bad. It's not great, but it's not like the worst case in the world. I think Dobbins' production strictly depends on his tackles being healthy. They missed last game in week 4, and then they were also injured mid-game in week 3 when Herbert also went down. So his production the last 2 games is kind of irrelevant. Over 4 games this season, he's averaging 13.9. But if you look at the first 2 games specifically, when the team was healthy, Dobbins was averaging 20.5 half PPR points per game. He was on fire, going over 130 yards rushing in each of them. So it's really dependent on the tackles being healthy. I'm probably going to update this ranking midweek. If you told me the tackles are healthy, I probably rank him top 15. If you told me the tackles are not healthy, I probably bump him down closer to RB30. It's all dependent on health. And at the moment, he's looking like a high-end flex play. It might change as the week progresses, though. Number 22, I have Najee Harris at Las Vegas, and I know he has not been anything special in 5 games this year. He's only averaging 9 points per game, but that's a decent floor, and it's only because he hasn't scored a single touchdown. If he gave you a touchdown, you're getting 15 plus points all of a sudden, and now you're very happy that you started Najee Harris. And this is a good matchup. It ranks top 8 against the position. The Raiders allow 23.6 points per game, 108 rushing yards per game, 6.2 catches per game for 37 receiving yards per game to the position, 5 touchdowns overall, 2 running backs in 5 games. So if it's going to happen for Najee, this is one of the matchups that you want to believe in. So I do think the ceiling is open for him. Obviously, it's not the safest bet, but the volume is there, and at some point it will inevitably hit. Maybe we need Russell Wilson as the quarterback in order for Najee to score. But I still think they'll move the ball well. The Raiders can't really stop anyone, and I do think Najee finally finds the end zone. He's a legit flex play, more on the high end of the spectrum, because the volume is safe. The floor is bust-proof. You're going to get 9 points no matter what, and if the touchdown hits, you will be very satisfied. But let's hope for the best. We'll see what happens, but at RB22, I'm comfortable starting Najee in week 6. At number 23, I have Rico Dowdle versus Detroit, and Dowdle has looked very good the last 2 games, averaging 15.5 points per game, 17 touches per game, 1.5 catch per game, 88 total yards per game, and 2 touchdowns, 1 in each of those games. So he's starting to look like a workhorse with 22 touches last week against Pittsburgh. That is what you want to see. He's clearly the guy in Dallas, but he gets a terrible matchup this week. I'm really worried about it. The Lions rank bottom 5 against the position, allowing only 15.9 points per game. And the only reason they're not last is because they gave up 3 touchdowns to Kenneth Walker. Otherwise, they only gave up 1 touchdown on the year to the position, and the stats are not good. On the ground, only 58 rushing yards per game, only 23 receiving yards per game, and I'm really worried that they do shut down Rico Dowdle. Dowdle is not as talented as Kenneth Walker. So on the year, he's only averaging 9.9 points per game. I do not think the last 2 weeks repeat in this matchup, and Dowdle, I think, will come way down to earth, but he's looked good. I do trust the volume, and there is a world where he does find the end zone. So he's not the worst flex play to start this week, but I think the matchup is very concerning. I would downgrade him for sure, and I'd probably rather start like a top 30 wide receiver at flex than Dowdle. I think the matchup is too scary. Number 24, I have Rhamondre Stevenson versus Houston, who did salvage his job. He had a long rushing touchdown early in that game, but overall I didn't feel like he played exceptionally well, and he's still a bit on the hot seat. He did not start last week, and he might lose his job to Antonio Gibson, who looks way more efficient despite a lot less volume. Rhamondre is only averaging 12 points per game this season in 5 games, 18 touches per game though, very high volume. He's averaging 79 yards per game with 3 total touchdowns, but it's really just a question of what does the team do in this matchup. If they play terribly, he is kind of game scripted out, and if he fumbles, then he's atrocious. He has had 3 good games, 2 terrible games, and you are kind of balancing the boom-bust equation with Rhamondre. This matchup, though, is a bad one. It ranks tied for number 27, so bottom 6 in the NFL. And while they have given up 4 running back touchdowns this season, I'm not convinced that Rhamondre does score this week. They only give up 85 rushing yards and 21 receiving yards per game to the position, and I'm not convinced Rhamondre will play well. Gibson has actually deserved more touches. We'll see what happens in this backfield this week. But for now, he's kept his job, and he is the guy you want in New England. We'll see what happens. I'm not dying to start him, though. I kind of want to see it one more time. Number 25 and 26, though, I have Tank Bigsby and Travis Etienne, both of the Jacksonville Jaguars. They're playing in London this week, and the team usually has an advantage in that matchup. But the Chicago Bears are actually kind of vulnerable to running backs this season. They rank as the number 9 matchup, giving up 22.7 points per game, 102 rushing yards per game, 28 receiving yards per game, and also 6 touchdowns overall to the position. So I kind of like this matchup here. I do think the running backs will get going. And on the season, Tank Bigsby is averaging more points than Etienne. 10.7 for Bigsby, only 10 points per game for Etienne, and both have 2 touchdowns on the year. The difference, though, is that Bigsby is definitely rising and gaining ground in this backfield. The last 2 games, Tank Bigsby averages 17.2 points per game on 10.5 touches, half a catch per game, 110 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. A lot of it, though, was based on big plays that happened last week. Etienne, however, is averaging more touches per game, 12 per game, 3.5 catches per game, 60 yards per game, no touchdowns over the last 2 weeks, only 7.8 points per game. So if you take the touchdowns out of the equation, it looks a lot more even. However, Bigsby has been far more explosive, far more efficient. And to top it all off, Etienne is dealing with a shoulder injury. He appears to be okay, but for him to be questionable at the moment, not ideal. I think it might be pivoting even more in favor of Tank Bigsby. So at the moment, I think it's kind of like a 53-47 split that barely favors Bigsby, but it is trending in his direction, and the gap is probably going to widen between these 2 players as the weeks go by. So I think Bigsby is the guy to have at the moment. You're kind of panicking if you have Etienne. I think he's lost almost all of his value. The floor is okay, but you're really dependent on touchdowns. And because of this committee, I think you're probably not dying to start either player, if not for a top 10 matchup this week. So good luck with both of them. If I have one in my lineup, I'd rather it be Tank Bigsby. Number 27, though, I have Dare Ogunbowale at New England, and the Patriots defense have given up 5 rushing touchdowns this season, 1 in every game to running backs. So there is probably going to be another one in this matchup, and Ogunbowale the last 3 games has kind of taken over as the guy in this backfield. He's averaging 9.6 points per game on only 9.7 touches, but last week it was 21 total touches, 6 catches, 87 yards. He did not score a touchdown, but he did score 11.7 points. And he had more touches in week 4 as well over Akers. I think he's definitely the guy you want, a lot more involved in the passing game as well. But because the Patriots give up rushing touchdowns, maybe it goes to Akers once again. Akers had scored 2 touchdowns the last 3 games. Ogunbowale only 1. So that is the only question mark. Where will the touchdown go? But Dameon Pierce's health is also a big variable in this backfield. If Dameon Pierce is healthy and Joe Mixon is not, I think Pierce could overtake both Ogunbowale and Akers, and it's going to be a very hard backfield to predict. So good luck. This ranking is dependent on both Mixon and Pierce missing the game. Right behind Ogunbowale, though, I have both Buccaneers running backs. I got Bucky Irving and Rachaad White at 28 and 29. And last week was kind of encouraging for Rachaad White, but only because of one big play and the fact that Bucky Irving fumbled. However, even after the fumble, they still brought Bucky Irving back on the field. He was not in the doghouse, and I think they know he's their more talented player. I still think they believe in him as the guy and want to get him more involved as the weeks go on. But the fumble was not great. Obviously, Bucky Irving needs to protect the ball, but over the course of the season, he is the only one who scored a touchdown of these two players, and without the fumble, the average is extremely close. Irving is averaging 7.5 points per game so far this year. Rachaad 8 points per game. So I prefer Bucky Irving, but just barely. I think both of them are really eating into each other's volume too much to really trust, and it's just not a committee I feel good about. The Saints are going to keep this game tight, and because of the touch split, I don't think either player is trustworthy this week. At RB 28 and 29, I'd much rather bench them. They are very low-end flex plays in week 6. Number 30, another hard player to trust. I got Jerome Ford at Philly, who is just not really doing much in this offense. An average of 9.9 points per game this season on 13.6 touches per game, 4 catches per game for only 67 yards per game, and 1 touchdown. Last week, he had just as many touches as D'Onta Foreman. So I really don't trust him from a ceiling standpoint. This offense really doesn't offer much at all. And if Nick Chubb is still off the field, then yeah, you trust him the most, but his ceiling is really capped. I think he's a low-end flex play who probably loses all value once Nick Chubb is healthy. So not excited with Ford. While he does offer some PPR value, not much upside. I'd rather just bench him. For the most part, I do not trust Jerome Ford. Number 31, though, moving forward, I think we're definitely benching these players, but if you are desperate, I understand there are 4 teams on bye. Austin Ekeler is not a bad bet. In 4 games this year, he's averaging 10.4 points per game on very limited touches. Only 7.5 touches per game, 2.8 catches per game, but for 75 yards per game, he gives you 10 yards per touch. So maybe they're going to start to use him more, but he did get banged up. He had a concussion earlier, and that has limited his production this season. But the main reason I'm not ranking him any higher is because Jeremy McNichols is involved. Over the last 2 weeks, McNichols has scored 3 touchdowns, and if he's vulturing those goal line touches from Ekeler, you're not happy about it. So I'm worried about his ceiling, but the floor has actually been pretty good. Ekeler has been very productive this year. The matchup is terrible, though, and if it wasn't for the injury to Bijan Robinson, I probably wouldn't rank him top 35. So he gets a slight increase because of that whole situation. However, I'm not dying to start that many Commanders running backs this week. The matchup is kind of gross. Number 32, though, I have Javonte Williams versus the Chargers, and the matchup ranks bottom 6. They're tied for number 27, only allowing 16.9 points per game to the position. Only 2 touchdowns this season in 4 games, an average of about 110 total yards per game to the running back position. But Javonte has been bad this year. 7.7 points per game, 14 touches per game, 3.4 catches per game, 64 yards per game, and no touchdowns. It's all kind of on the back of last week as well. In week 5, he played excellent against Las Vegas, 13.6 points, no touchdown, but 111 total yards and 5 catches. He was very good against Las Vegas. However, Tyler Beatty is no longer on the field. He's on IR, and it looks like Audric Estime might be returning this week. So the backfield gets more crowded, and without a touchdown, you never have a high upside with Javonte. I still don't want to start him. The matchup's bad. I'm going to bench him this week. I'm also benching Alexander Mattison versus Pittsburgh, and if Jahmyr White does play, then you're probably not really moving the needle on Mattison. He's been the better player this season in fantasy, but the matchup is bottom 4. The Steelers ranked number 29, only giving up 15.5 points per game to the position on about 110 total yards per game, only 2 touchdowns in 5 weeks. So not ideal. Mattison is very touchdown dependent this season, but he is averaging 9.1 points per game on the back of 3 touchdowns in 5 weeks. So that's what you're hoping for. Last week he was okay, only 7.1 points is nothing special, but he didn't find the end zone. He had 17 total touches, 2 catches, 61 yards against the Broncos. It wasn't the best matchup overall. So Mattison has some appeal. He's just very touchdown dependent, and the Steelers are not a good matchup. I'm not going to bet on it, but if I am rostering one Raiders running back this season, moving forward, it would be Alexander Mattison. I do not trust Jahmyr White. at all. Number 34, I have Cam Akers at New England. And if Dameon Pierce or Joe Mixon are healthy, then you can completely drop him. But if they're not, then Akers is still involved in this backfield. He's not getting any receptions, really. That's all kind of going to Ogunbowale, but he is scoring 2 touchdowns over the last 3 games is somewhat viable. So that's the only thing you're excited about in the last 3 games. He's averaging 8.8 points per game on 11.3 touches per game. Without a touchdown, though, you're getting burned entirely. So that is what needs to happen. The Patriots have given up 5 rushing touchdowns this season, and it's not the worst bet in the world, but it's very touchdown dependent. I'd rather avoid the risk and just cut Akers. At some point, this backfield will get healthy and he will offer no value at all. Number 35, though, kind of a shocker, is Roschon Johnson of the Bears. In his last 3 games, he's averaging 10.4 points per game with 3 touchdowns overall. That's really, really encouraging. It doesn't look like he's going away. It is a bit of a committee between him and DeAndre Swift. So that's what you're hoping for. The matchup ranks top 6, so it could definitely happen again. The Jaguars have given up 6 touchdowns to the position so far this season. So hopefully Roschon can score again, but at this point you're really desperate. I'm not trying to start Roschon if I can avoid it. I do have Braelon Allen, though, right behind him at number 36, and the matchup is top 2 this week. Braelon could score a touchdown. That's what you're hoping for. He's averaging 7.5 points per game on 8 touches per game this season. He's not the worst bet. He is talented. It's just a question of what will this committee look like with a new coach in New York. Number 37, I have Tyler Algier at Carolina, and he gets a excellent matchup. The Panthers rank number 1 overall against the position, and maybe Algier vultures a touchdown from Bijan, but he's been pretty effective this season on only 7.8 touches. He's giving you 45 yards per game. He is rather efficient from a yards per carry standpoint, but only a 5.1 point per game average. In fantasy, it's not that safe. Behind him at 38, I have Tyjae Spears versus the Colts, who gets a top 10 matchup this week. Tyjae is averaging 7.1 points per game this season, catching 3 passes per game, and he did score a touchdown the last time we saw him. He's not the worst bet in the world, but at 38, I'll probably leave him on the bench. 39, I have Justice Hill, who in 5 games is averaging 8.1 points per game, 52 total yards. He is getting it done in the passing game sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. Number 40, I have Antonio Gibson, who in 5 games is averaging 6.7 points per game. No touchdowns this year, but 59 total yards per game. Very decent floor. 5.9 yards per carry is, I think, a reason why Rhamondre might lose his job at some point. I do think Gibson deserves more volume. Obviously, with more volume, though, the efficiency will come down, and it's a question of will they actually start pivoting to him more as the yards per carry indicates they should. That is the question. We'll see what happens. But these last 10 I'll just rip through. I don't think they're safe at all, but you're really just hoping for a touchdown with all of them. Charbonnet with Walker on the field is averaging 7.8 points per game. You could do worse than Charbonnet. Jaleel scored a touchdown last week, his 2nd on the year, but without it, you're getting nothing, so not going to bet on him. Jeremy McNichols over the last 2 weeks has scored 3 touchdowns. Maybe that continues, but probably not going to bet on it that much. Number 44, I have Amir Abdullah, who did score a touchdown, did put up 12.6 points last week without Jahmyr. Maybe he's involved alongside Mattison. Number 45, I got Deontay Foreman at Philly, who had just as many touches as Jerome Ford last week, but still not enough to trust. Number 46, I got Tyler Goodson, who had 7.2 points last week. Not bad. Didn't score a touchdown, so kind of a decent floor, but really touchdown dependent. No thank you. And then I'm not starting Gus Edwards, Emmanuel Wilson, Miles Sanders. They're just too risky to bet on, averaging less than 5.5 points per game this season. But the last player I'll mention is Audric Estime versus the Chargers, who might return off IR this week. He could actually have a lot of value rest of season if he can overtake Javonte in this backfield. It is possible. I'm not betting on it, but it is possible I'll mention him before I wrap up the video. Here are my top 40 rankings, though. The video is essentially over. I feel really good about the top 13. All the way through James Conner, I think they're locks in your lineup. The top 3 are truly elite this season. No one is benching them. You're expecting 20-plus points every single week. But everyone from Bijan through James Conner, I think will give you at least 15, 16-plus points because the touchdown should hit for all of them. Starting with DeAndre Swift, though, we're kind of matchup dependent, and we're hoping for the best, but I do like the floor for everyone all the way through Najee Harris this week. The only players with bad matchups in this tier would be Bijan Robinson Jr. and J.K. Dobbins, and they both have the ability to score a touchdown and go over 100 yards on the game. So while the matchups are a little scary, I still trust the floor for the most part, and the players that are a little more dicey like Swift, Pollard, and Najee Harris have really good matchups. Tyrone Tracy, Trey Sermon expected to see a big workload if their starters are not healthy this week. And I do think the top 22 are very good plays, should give you double-digit points this week. Starting with Rico Dowdle, though, I am definitely downgrading them. They're kind of more desperate flex plays, and if you need to start them, I get it, but the situation might be kind of complicated, especially like the Bigsby Etienne backfield, the Bucky Irving Rachaad White backfield. That's all kind of weird, and there's some bad matchups for other players who may have a workhorse type of role. So running back gets pretty brutal. I think once you hit Rachaad White, though, you are benching those players, very touchdown dependent after that point, and especially with bad matchups outside the top 38, I am benching everyone for sure. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. I will update these rankings on Saturday, as always, with all the injury news coming in. But until then, I'll see you next time. My name is Adam Riancho, and thank you for watching Nice and Blunt.